thank you so much for being with us for Conversations About Change. This is a series of conversations with Arts Philadelphia partners from the last 10 years, a way of marking our 10-year anniversary. But it's also about changing the lives of people affected by dementia for the better together, and how our partners and we envision doing that and having some conversations about it. So I'm delighted that my guest today is Dr. Jason Karlawish. Jason is a professor of medicine, medical ethics and health policy, and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. He is board certified in geriatric medicine and is the author of the recent book, and I'm going to read it because it's lengthy, The Problem of Alzheimer's: How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis and What We Can Do About It. Welcome, Jason. Thanks so much for being with me.
Welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for having me. It's a thrill.
Thank you. So
congratulations on 10 years of.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And frankly, part of the reason that we're still here 10 years later is because of the collaborations we've had over the years, including with Penn Memory Center, which will come up. So if you would just start by sharing with us a little bit about your personal and your professional experiences related to dementia.
So I've been a physician in practice at Penn after I finished my fellowship in 1997, and been there ever since, and started work in what was then called the Memory Disorders Clinic around about 1998, 1999. We changed the name to the Penn Memory Center a few years later, and I see patients there every Friday, more or less, for diagnosis and follow-up care. In the practice is focused on diagnosis and care of persons who have developed a cognitive and related problems in life, typically from diseases like Alzheimer's, but by no means the only diseases we diagnose. And that clinical work has been sort of the foundation for informing a host of different writing and research projects emanating in that space, largely surrounding topics in the ethics and policy as they intersect with what it's like to live with, or the threat of living with a brain that is changing because of these diseases. And then, personally, I have begun to experience what it's like to be a caregiver as a result of my father developing cognitive impairment. And that's been incredibly informative. Obviously, I had a sense of what it's like from a third-person accounts, but once you have a first-person account, you also gain additional perspectives and insights into what it's like.
Thank you for that. So, Jason, to state the obvious, you're a medical doctor. You're director of the Penn Program on Precision Medicine for the Brain, co-associate director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and co-director of the Penn Memory Center. Could you tell us a little bit about how you view the pharmacological and non-pharmacological balance within the field of supportive interventions for people living with dementia, and how your views on this subject may have evolved over the past decade?
Yeah, well, first, I frame them as pharmacologic and behavioral and psychological and social interventions to try to break away from this distinction of pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic. Because I think defining something by what it's not conveys a message that is not, I think, desired. And I think if there's one organ that particularly benefits from the combination of pharmacologic and behavioral, environmental, and social interventions, it's the brain. And I think on the topic of pharmacologic interventions, we actually have a wealth of interventions that we can use for patients to help with problems related to mood and cognition, particularly memory and attention, meaning drugs that have an efficacy for treating those problems related to anxiety, depression, difficulties with concentration and recall. But we also have a wealth of interventions that use manipulations of the environment, the interactions with other individuals, the engagement with the world that can address those very same problems. And I think both those in treatments used judiciously can be really very beneficial. Having said that, I think that we neglect the value of the behavioral and social and psychological interventions sometimes, and the we here is my profession, medicine, and that's understandable. I mean, we were trained about diagnosis and treatment of diseases using a biomedical model, which is generally a good model. But if you think about what it's like to live with a disease like Alzheimer's, it's about your daily life being affected. And so the more we can think about, well, what is a typical day and what constitutes that day, the more we can make someone feel sort of quality of mind, peace of mind. I do think, where our field struggles now in general, the field of medicine is we have a pretty decent system to deliver medical care. It's got its stark inequities, but we have a pretty lousy system to deliver what is the awkwardly titled long-term care services and supports, which pretty much takes the enthusiasm out of the room when you hear that. But it's those behavioral, social, and psychological interventions. And that reflects just some systematic, decades-long failures in policy to address those matters. I'm cautiously optimistic we might begin to change that. Now, I'll wrap up with the advent of therapies that might slow some of these diseases, particularly Alzheimer's disease right now, is very encouraging. It's really quite exciting, but it actually creates greater urgency for the need to provide care for the feelings of living with the disease. Because if you extend the period of disease, courtesy of a drug that slows it, particularly the period of early in the disease, you really intensify the need to address those experiences of living with the disease. So, short of a cure for each and every disease that causes a brain to change and not function as well in the environment, short of a cure for all those, we're going to have to figure out how to live with these diseases. So that animates a lot of the thinking I have and the work I do.
Let me ask you about the fact that recent data show that 50% or more of primary care physicians feel uncomfortable, ill-equipped to even discuss Alzheimer's disease with their patients. What do you think that's about?
A host of factors all intersecting in kind of a grisly vortex of a problem. Lack of training. And you say, well, why is there a lack of training given such the size of the problem? And I think it reflects that, it wasn't until 1980, literally 1980, that the federal government through the NIH took interest in studying these diseases. That's not that long ago in the history of a disease, if you think about it. Particularly a disease that's been around for a long time. Unlike, say, COVID wasn't really around, but it came with a flurry and we had to address it. But these diseases have been around for centuries, but they've been embedded in a culture that sort of normalized them, number one, as part of a life course problem, or number two, viewed them as largely either personal or family matters to be addressed through traditional structures of care, particularly in the family structure, which in our nation and Western world largely relied on women serving in a caregiving role that wasn't even acknowledged as a caregiving role. And so, it wasn't until 1980 that there began to be a pivot to say, well, no, those are caregivers and they're treating people, caring for people who have a disease, not normal aging. And, that's 40 years ago. That's not that long. And so so medicine is a very traditional field. I mean, so it's taken medicine a long time to sort of pivot and inculcate those ideas, the new ideas. So that might lead to, I think, I don't know, maybe a creation of a whole new field in medicine that's focused on the diagnosis and treatment of the aging brain. Because quite frankly, there isn't a field that you leave trained to be an Alzheimer's specialist. So no, wait a minute, wait. A neurologist, surely. And most neurologists can't say no. When I finished residency, I was not skilled in the diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's. I mean, I've had some acquaintance with it. When you finish internal medicine, even geriatric medicine, you're okay, but there's unevenness, and certainly that's the case in psychiatry. So, I mean, until that's addressed, I think no wonder the primary care doctors are like, I don't even know how to talk about this. And then, you add in things like doctors don't like to be uncertain. Doctors don't like to be ambivalent. And if you are uncertain and ambivalent about something, you're not going to talk about it. You're going to ignore it, and even have kind of almost a transference reaction about it. And I'll wrap up. I mean, we've done interviews with physicians about their willingness to use various diagnostic tests for the disease. And you pick up just these points. I mean, some of them are like, well, if I knew more, I would use it. And others are really hostile. I mean, they're like, well, there's nothing you can do. And why would you tell someone this? All you're going to do is upset them. And you read this, you're like, oh, come on, man. I mean, if that was your approach to this disease, we could run down a whole list of awful diseases that you wouldn't tell people. And so I think it gets to these, actually, they're channeling attitudes and cultural tropes that they don't even realize it in the guise of medicine. So we got a lot of work to do. Yeah,
absolutely. So let's go back to pharmacological and behavioral interventions. See, I've already learned something today. Let's talk a little bit about why, I'm making an assumption here, why you feel that Penn Memory Center and your patients benefit from a connection with Arts Philadelphia.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the idea of, supporting and sustaining a mind that's in some way damaged by these diseases. Creating an environment that supports that mind, that allows it to be cared for, is essential. And so what are the ways you do that? Well, one way I think that you can do that is to harness the inherent human skill of being creative. And I know, our mutual friend and colleague Ann Basting has been a brilliant theoretician and practitioner in this space. I think once you say the word creative, especially for some reason in America, people get all intimidated and or dismissive in ways that are fascinating. Yeah. Well, I'm not creative, or I don't do arts, or that seems unnecessary. And some of this reflects that we have an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and math. And so these other things seem to be to the wayside. We could go on about that. But the fact is that, all of us have some desire to sort of either observe the arts, at least to be entertained, but also to be provoked, and to some degree to create them. Mm-hmm. And the thing that makes them very valuable, I think, in the care of people with diseases like Alzheimer's who are symptomatic and disabled from them, is much of the arts, though not all, certainly, it isn't very dependent on memory and some other taxing cognitive demands, or it can be adjusted such that it isn't demanding. And number two, it can become a very interactive exercise. And so it allows, I think, the family members to do two things. One, to kind of almost figure out what's going on inside the person. What are they feeling? What are they thinking? Mm-hmm. And then number two, once you sort of do that, you can begin to connect and make meaning and help make sense of the experience. And you've told me, and I've certainly witnessed it just a week or two ago. For example, I got an email. The bottom line of it was that a wife and her husband were able, courtesy of Zoom, to attend a chamber music event. And he's quite disabled from his disease. And the particular concert, in fact, was one that the performance they had seen years ago, et cetera. And she simply recounts how, despite his impairments in language, despite his notable impairments in memory, he clearly was enjoying the piece and clearly was connecting with her in the sort of mutual feeling about this is a piece that we've enjoyed and whatnot.
Mm.
You know, that's the music piece. It could be an art piece, that just say plastic art, you know, representational painting, etc., dance, etc. But the arts aren't just. I guess I'd wrap up with. We don't view the arts at the Memory Center as just entertainment to sort of fill the time, although certainly it has that role in a way but as a way to understand what's going on inside a person, what are they feeling, and then also to begin to provide care. And so that's why I think Arts Philadelphia is among those interventions that, you know, we prescribe. You say, oh, don't say that. I don't want to medicalize what I do, but it helps me to frame it that way because it emphasizes the importance of it, just like I might prescribe donepezil or someday Leqembi or donanemab or whatever other therapies that, you know, get a pad and get reimbursed through Medicare and all those other formal structures that, you know, they met.
And I will just take this opportunity to say, no, I actually appreciate your using the term prescribe, because we in America are lagging behind other countries across the globe that are prescribing,
Yeah.
you know,
It's
fresh
because I did social
vegetables and
prescribing is what they call it.
exactly,
Quirky term.
exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, you know, the fact that someone in your position feels that it's appropriate to use the term prescription is a source of hope for me.
Well, good. Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
will tell patients. I'll actually say, so are you doing a ceramics class? And they'll look at me like, what? Well, so I'm like, well, why aren't you? Um, uh, and they'll say, well, I just don't know about one or whatnot. You know, and I I don't want to privilege ceramics, but there's an activity which, again, you know, it's not memory dependent. It's very physical. It's a feel to it. There's a process. Um, you actually create something, etc. And I've got a couple of patients who have taken on ceramics and really enjoy it,
Yeah.
and others who just, you know, don't. But it's not this privileged ceramics, but that framing of that, I think, I find it very helpful as opposed to, yeah, I'm trying to be prescriptive.
So here's a question. You've already indirectly addressed it, but what kinds of changes do you think we need to make in how we understand, how we interact with, how we treat people living with dementia and their care partners in order to create a framework in which it's possible to have a better life
Yeah.
with these illnesses?
Yeah, my thinking on this of late is more and more intensified around a couple core themes. You know, one is to take seriously why in the modern era in particular we started to really care about these diseases. You know, the first federal report focused on Alzheimer's was published in 1987, and it was called "Losing a Million Minds: Confronting the Tragedy of Alzheimer's." And that title, I think, still resonates today. The idea of mind loss kind of haunts the disease, particularly in popular culture, more so than if you read in the professional literature. You know, mind has had a difficult relationship in the medicine, kind of sidelined in psychiatry, not very much paid attention to even in neurology, and yet it's what people really fundamentally care about. You know, in the 5 M's of geriatrics, M number one, which is sort of a mantra, you know, mind, mobility. Well, the first M is mind, for example. So I think that we have to start taking mind seriously, and then framed that way, you do have to acknowledge that once you have clinically evident Alzheimer's disease or Lewy body disease or frontal temporal lobar degeneration or progressive supranuclear palsy or any of these other diseases that cause neurodegeneration, once it becomes clinically evident, your mind in some way is changed. I'll use a word because I'm a doctor, you know, damaged. It's not the same as it was. And I think the task of diagnosis and care is, in what ways is it damaged and how can it be supported and or repaired even. And I think that's where the caregiver walks in, because I think caregiving ultimately I would see as mind support is what I'd like to think of it. obviously caregivers are almost, they're cognitive prosthetics oftentimes early on, just the reminding device, the calendar on the wall, it's kept up to date. But most caregivers will tell you, even early on, they're in some way augmenting the person's agency and experience, which are the two sort of axes of mind. Or if they're not, things go wrong, or someone else does it. Instead, they pay someone else or whatever. And so that corporate plural is really, we've always respected that with the disease, but I don't think we've really framed it in a way that captures its, I'll be blunt, neuroscientific and ethical significance. Neuroscientifically, because it's about the mind, and ethically, because once you see something has a mind, you treat it very differently than if you don't think it has a mind. And you have only to look at sort of the way we treat artificial intelligence devices that we really sort of adore. We really give them a lot of respect in ways that get a little weird. But that's okay, because listen to what we're feeling there when we, become devoted to some AI device, etc., or our pet, our dog or whatever it may be. Because part of that is because we see it has experiences in the world and treat things differently that we feel have experiences in the world than if we don't. Those are just objects. We may revere it for its value. It's worth $300,000 in gold, but that's a different sentiment than it's an entity with a mind. So I think we need to take mind more seriously, and that's where the arts come in, because I think the arts really are a key way, as I said earlier, to connect with.
That it's really interesting. Having experiences in the world, what a great way to capture the fact that even with memory loss, which is not, that is an attribute of some dementia related conditions, not all, but I had a student, I think, as you know, we have a program in which people living with dementia and their care partners mentor future healthcare providers. We're doing that in some way to address the issue that we were talking about previously, which is, the discomfort among many doctors and other healthcare providers about even talking about these illnesses. But so one of our earliest students said, as a first-year medical student, she came to the program because she had taken an anthropology course in college where the question of what makes us human was being discussed, and apparently the lecturer was a care partner for her mom, and so this was a very personal thing. And Micah said they started talking about, is it memory that makes us human, and is that why people living with memory affecting dementia conditions are marginalized? And Micah herself said, I started thinking maybe it's not about memory, maybe it's about the ability to care for others and to be cared for. So again, that notion of having experiences in the world. So yeah. I love that that notion, and I think it's an incredibly helpful notion. I guess a follow-up question that I have is, you are, dare I say, one of the enlightened ones. Yeah. How do we, and I mean, is it fair to say actually that your sense of the importance of the mind, first and foremost in relation to these illnesses, has evolved over the years? Is that?
Yeah. No, there's no question. Yeah, I mean, that, and some of that is simply doing what academics do, which is, think deeply and ask questions that are hard to answer and get angry and frustrated and then learn. And then That's interesting, but the next step is, well, is any of this worth other people learning about? What's otherwise known as translation and dissemination.
Right, exactly. And that was my question. That's my next question is, if your sense is that we need to attend to this different philosophical approach as well as,
Scientific.
right. What changes can be implemented so that others do see the value?
Yeah, I'd like to see. So, a dream of reason, it would be to see organizations that exist in society recognize that they could have a real role here. And the two broad categories that I think are three, I'll say, are museums, libraries, and arts institutions. And that's not to say that museums, libraries, and arts institutions should stop doing what they're doing. So, arts institutions having great events that are, buy your ticket, show up, etc. Museums having a standing gallery and then rotating exhibitions. And libraries, we've got books and the quiet space. Please keep it quiet, to work. But how can they add to what they do, given who they are, to serve in this role? And the fourth organization I haven't mentioned, but our adult day activity programs. Wait. The Philadelphia Museum of Art is not going to open up an adult day activity program. Okay, fine. But could they think about how they would partner with adult day activity programs? Could the Philadelphia Opera think about that? And I'm naming organizations not to call them out, but I'm just, I'm not going to speak locally, but I mean, our city is actually a pretty darn good city in terms of our arts and museum-based resources. And I don't want to list the list because I don't want to make it sound like I'm calling out one or the other or neglect others. But the more I sort of explore, the more I'm like, we've got a lot of untapped capital here. It's when I chat with the artists as well. They want to do their art. But many of them are also interested in this kind of, I'll use a loaded term, but the service aspect to it.
Yeah.
And so my dream would be that, either the existing adult day activity programs or the activity programs that have yet to be created make this part of what they do. And you say, well, what is this, Jason? Well, that gets to like Arts Philadelphia, because I think you're a good example of one of the bridging methods that, in your case, it's museum work, related kind of curatorial.
And music and
true actually. I mean, the guts were museum.
Yeah.
And so that's the vision, and again, I'm medicalizing it a bit because that's kind of the way you get people to pay attention, because otherwise it's just sort of entertainment. They just can't see the value in it.
Well, and so just one more follow-up. I think our niche exists because 10 years ago, in the Philadelphia region, there were not museums and art centers and libraries and who am I forgetting? What did I just do? Anyway, there were not cultural institutions by and large who were attending to people affected by dementia-related conditions. I'm happy to say that is changing. But I will quote one of your colleagues, Anjan Chatterjee at Penn, who said to me 9 years ago or 10 years ago, until there is hard, scientifically executed or conducted research showing the impact of programs like ours, the medical profession, by and large, will continue to view such programs as fringe and will not be convinced.
Yeah.
It seems like you have a slightly different take on that.
I guess I do, because I guess I appreciate what Anjan says. There's no question that and I understand why in medicine in particular, we're very adamant, show me the evidence to support the prescription,
Right.
because otherwise, then I'll use a fancy word, the epistemic basis upon which medicine exerts its authority, and absent evidence, if it's just we'll do it because we want to, then
Mhm.
why go to med school? So I get that perspective, but there's another frame to these interventions, which is kind of a basic, um, uh, I'm not sure if this is the right term, but a basic human rights approach,
Mhm.
perhaps a human flourishing approach. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't need data that shows me that, food, water, and an environment that's within a range of temperature that's whatever are necessary for human flourishing. I mean, and so I guess what I'm getting at is some of this is about human flourishing and how to help humans whose minds are partly damaged to still flourish. And that starts to walk you right back into the biomedical questions. But, I'd be shocked if there was someone who said, show me the evidence that adult activity programs work, because otherwise we shouldn't have them.
Mhm.
I think the question, though, becomes, and where I think Anjan and I, there's not a disagreement, but where we is, what are the best ways to do it? And there, you certainly want to bring in some degree of evidence gathering and comparative effectiveness work. And I mean, I think, we all agree education is valuable, but, what's the right way to teach math? Well, that's something that we should bring some evidence to bear, for example.
Mhm.
So I think there's a role for the scientific method to advance these, and I'm not anti-science in this topic, but I think to dismiss it all full out and say, well, there's no evidence that this works, so why are we doing it? It has elements then of almost leading to absurd conclusions around a host of things in life that are important for human flourishing. Um, so that's kind of my biomedical slash uh, arts and humanities thinking on this.
And ethical, I would say. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and I want to be very clear. Anjan is not the one who needs convincing. He was
yeah.
just saying to me that we are going to continue to have to fight to get the kinds of social prescribing that we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
if these kinds of studies don't exist.
I mean, if Medicaid is willing to
Yes.
pay for adult day and related activities, which it will do,
Mhm.
implicitly Medicaid is saying, well, we think these are worthwhile for people who meet poverty or means tested thresholds,
Mhm.
albeit what they pay for, the quality you could strongly debate, and et cetera. So you have a foothold to say there's some recognition that this is valuable
Mhm.
for people who meet certain income and means tested thresholds. So what does it mean for the rest of us who don't require Medicaid or qualify for it? Well, that becomes very interesting. So then, what social structure will support that for long-term care services and supports, and why?
Yeah.
So
And
yeah, yeah.
so, sort of getting to the point where we're wrapping up, how would you say that the Penn Memory Center's work addresses the need for the kinds of changes that you've been talking about?
Yeah, broadly, two approaches. One is a, a part of one of the foci of our communications work is to talk about and promote this programming, these ideas, and normalize the conversation about them.
Mhm.
And then the second is at the point of care for individuals. The standard diagnostic workup at the center ultimately leads to a diagnostic follow-up visit, where in addition to close engagement and interaction with the physician, uh, is close engagement interaction with our social work and social support services team. And part of what they provide and recommend um, is access to and engagement with the kind of activities that Arts Philadelphia does. And our programming that we offer includes activities like memory cafes, etc., where engagement with the arts is part of what's done there. And so that's just part of what we do. I mean, in the same way as, what we do is cognitive testing and as appropriate neuroimaging, et cetera. When it comes time for care, this is on the list of the things that we provide. And that's great. The plaintiff note, meaning sad, is that much of that work is made possible by, philanthropy, because the system just doesn't support it. That's okay. We manage, but it says something about, again, the system in which we have and its stark limits.
Yeah, I second that motion. So, Jason, is there anything I haven't asked you or anything you would like to say in conclusion that you want people watching this interview to think about in relation to creating change in order that people living with dementia-related conditions and their care partners have that supported life?
Yeah, I would say to people, have hope and be inspired. I think that as I look back over the last several years, I think I'm seeing change happen. And so, if in addition to personally accessing this for your own needs, if you'd like to be part of the sort of conversation that's going to change the system, speak up and speak out, get in touch with us, because I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll look back 5-10 years from now and say, how far we've come. I'll leave you. So I'm encouraged that, when I go on every Monday to our consensus meetings and related meetings at the Memory Center, the crowd of individuals in various levels of training, medical students on up, even undergrads, for example, is far bigger than it ever was. And that gives me hope, because each of those people are going to go on and do something, and they hear these messages. So, if you who are listening to or watching Susan and I talk want to say, well, I'd like to do something in this space, there's opportunities, so give a holler.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason, for your time.